Doc, appreciate you carving out some time today.
No problems, Marc.
Listen, can we kick things off here maybe by giving listeners and viewers a little whirlwind tour of your background before we dive into all things why we eat?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a bariatric surgeon, which means that I do surgery for people who are struggling so much with their weight that they become, severely obese. They come to my clinic. They ask me to either bypass or remove their stomach. So these are increasingly popular operations. And I've been a surgeon doing this type of surgery now for about 20 years. I work at UCLH, which is a big NHS hospital in central London. Also do some private work as well. But the whole sort of interaction with patients who suffer with obesity really stimulated my interest in the whole background of our understanding of obesity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what's, formed the ideas of doing some research for this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating read, and obviously a concern around the world, isn't it? I mean, as we gain more weight, and obesity and overweight is what 2/3 now in a lot of major countries, and that predisposes to all sorts of the chronic conditions and metabolic conditions. And it's interesting when you open your book on the genetic side and the epigenetic side, and you talk about people who are, let's say, lucky, obesity resistant versus some who are obesity vulnerable versus others who might actually be more obesity sensitive. Can you unpack that a little bit for folks?
Yeah, so we know, so the main concept in the book is that people have their own individual weight set point. So this is, people sort of know what that is. I mean, if you suffer with being overweight or obese, you know that if you lose a load of weight, 5, 10, 15 kilograms on increasingly severe dietary measures, that actually eventually your weight will be pulled back towards your weight set point. So This is why dieters recurrently fail. But actually, quite a lot of people never have that experience. Their weight set point is set at a sort of healthy level. And a lot of skinny people, including me when I was younger, can't put weight on. It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this sort of genetically set weight. And there's a lot of evidence that it is genetically set from twin and adoption studies. So very eloquent studies looking at unfortunate sets of identical twins that, for whatever circumstances, had to be separated at birth and brought up in different homes. Identical DNA. And when you look at these offspring as they become adults, 20, 30 years later, you find that there is a 75% concordance of their body mass index, so their weight. So it's almost similar to, you would expect identical twins to be the same height and have the same eye color.
Yeah.
But actually, even if they're brought up in different houses, they will have pretty similar body mass index. So they'll be either skinny or fat, depending on their genes. So prior to these studies, a lot of people would blame, the home environment for someone either becoming obese or not becoming obese, or becoming, remaining fit. But actually, these studies prove that that's not really the case. It's much more to do with your genes than your home environment. Home environment produces about a 10% effect on your body mass index. So you can have someone who's brought up in a relatively healthy eating and play environment, and someone who's brought up in an unhealthy eating and play environment. But if they have the same genes, they're going to end up pretty similar as far as the body mass index is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's a striking finding. And as we think about genetics, and then of course epigenetics, and these changes that are going to happen a little bit more quickly from generation to generation, can we actually even talk about bariatric surgery? Because when we talk about maintaining weight or losing weight, obviously appetite's a huge part of this. Whether how hungry we feel, how satiated we feel after meals, or lack thereof. And of course, there's some surprising findings on actually what bariatric surgery does to appetite. Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah, sure. So we have an emerging understanding that, our weight set point, so if this individual weight that I mentioned before that our body tries to maintain, it thinks it is our healthy weight, even if it's obese. It thinks it wants to stay that way. If we lose weight, it's going to drag us back up there. And two factors will drag us back to our weight set point. One is our appetite and satiety, so our drive to eat or not eat, and that's hormonally driven. And the second one is our basal metabolism, so the amount of energy, even without getting out of bed, the amount of energy we burn off.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of emerging evidence that hormones, from as far as the drives to eat and stop eating are concerned, that hormones from our stomach and our small intestine or guts actually have a profound effect on our behavior. And this is why the new types of bariatric surgery, the gastric bypass and the sleeve hysterectomy, where we remove or bypass the stomach, actually work. They have a profound effect on those hormones. So, for instance, I'll mention three hormones. The first is ghrelin, which is produced by the body and the top floppy part of the stomach. And this is a hormone that if we miss a couple of meals or we go fasting for a couple of days, will increase significantly in our bloodstream. It will go to our hypothalamus and it will stimulate voracious sort of drive to eat, food-seeking behavior, seeking out high-calorie foods. So ghrelin is very important to stop us, losing weight if we miss a couple of meals. Now, once we do a sleeve hysterectomy, where we actually remove part of the stomach where that hormone is secreted, the ghrelin levels drop significantly. So suddenly the patient sort of feels as if their appetite has just been switched off in their brain.
Wow.
They're losing weight seamlessly because their stomach is smaller. They can't eat as much, but they don't feel that, that rebound appetite that, is a real cause of dietary recidivism. The second two hormones that are affected in gastric bypass and bariatric surgery are satiety hormones. So they are called peptide YY, PYY, and glucagon-like peptide 1, so GLP-1. And both of these hormones are produced by the small bowel, and they're sort of like they're secreted when the small bowel senses food within it. So, i.e., the person's been eating, particularly protein, they're secreted after sensing. And again, they go to the hypothalamus, and they are the trigger to stop eating, because we obviously have to have a trigger to stop eating, otherwise we'll be eating all the time. So these are really important hormones that will stop us eating. And with both the sleeve hysterectomy and the gastric bypass, both of those hormones increase substantially. So people have the perception after a really small snack of that sort of, I don't really want to eat. I don't even have any urge to eat at lunch. They have to sort of put their alarm on to remind them to eat and get some nutrition in at lunchtime.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So that's PYY and GLP-1. GLP-1 as well as causing satiety, increases the effectiveness of insulin. So it increases almost the strength of insulin. So you don't need as much of it. And as is explained in the book, insulin is really, really critical in changing a weight set point via this process called leptin resistance.
Yeah, I was going to say, a couple of things I think about there. One of them is just the importance of protein as the building blocks. If those key sensors are really responding more predominantly to something like protein, it definitely hammers home that message around, when we look at the general population, a lot of people still struggle to hit the RDA of 0.8 grams per kilo.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, we've understood for a long time that, saturated fat and protein do increase satiety, and now we sort of know why it increases these gut hormones and acts hypothalamically.
Yeah, that's tremendous. And then you mentioned leptin, and obviously, as people gain weight, a significant amount of weight, that leptin signal doesn't work as well. We become resistant, as you mentioned, to that, and of course, insulin, that signaling doesn't work as well, and due to this chronic inflammation that is the milieu that starts to increase, and that noise gets so loud that these signals really can't be heard appropriately. Can you talk a little bit about how TNF-alpha plays a role in this whole story?
Sure, yeah. I think you mentioned leptin resistance, and this is the absolute crux of understanding obesity. And this is the thing that actually even most doctors don't understand. And it's probably the reason that we have, societal prejudice against people who are struggling with obesity.
Yeah.
So leptin is the hormone that comes from our fat cells. So the more fat we have, the higher the level of leptin in the bloodstream. And leptin levels are sensed by the hypothalamus, which controls our eating and our metabolism, so the amount of energy we take in, the amount of energy we expend. And the hypothalamus is very, very sensitive. It wants to know how much fuel or energy or fat we have on board. It's very important. This is like a crucial survival sort of signal.
Yeah, through evolution, we had to really know how much fuel we had, didn't we?
Exactly. Well, all species have this sense. They need to know how much energy is on board. And leptin is a crucial signal. And the higher the leptin level, if you do start to increase weight, say you go on holiday or whatever, and you're all inclusive for a couple of weeks, you put on
Nice.
pounds or kilograms, your leptin level will go up, and the hypothalamus will sense it, and it will think, oh, actually, we're okay. We've got enough energy on board. We can like ratchet down on the appetite, and we can just slowly, slightly increase our metabolic rate, just burn off a little bit more energy seamlessly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why a lot of people, when they've put a little bit of weight on during their holiday, actually it's quite easy to lose it. They think that maybe they're, a few sessions in the gym or a little bit of
stuck.
The latest diet is working, but actually it's not. It's the leptin signal that is actually working for them. If you become sick and you lose some weight, your leptin signal goes down, your leptin levels go down, the hypothalamus responds to it. It will give you a voracious appetite. You're going to go out, you're going to, eat extra meals, chocolate, whatever, and you're going to feel very lazy. Metabolic rate's gone down. So this is the way that leptin signaling sort of keeps us at our particular weight set point. When we have an environment where there is too much sugar and refined carbohydrates, we have a population whose insulin levels on average are much, much higher. Because insulin obviously is produced in response to sugar and carbohydrate intake. Insulin signals on the same cell as of the hypothalamus that leptin does. So it has a joint signal. The more insulin you have, the weaker the leptin signal. So you have this situation in populations in Western societies with highly refined food and high sugar foods, where they have high leptin levels. They are fat. They have far too much energy on board. But because their insulin levels are so high, that signal is being obscured. So your brain can't see it. It can't tell that you're carrying too much weight. And this is a thing called leptin resistance, which is what happens with end-stage obesity. And it's not just insulin that causes that. It's the other thing that you mentioned, inflammation. So inflammation is a secondary effect of obesity. So every person who's obese will have a low-grade inflammation in their body. And this produces an inflammatory factor called TNF-alpha, which has been shown, one, to interfere with insulin signaling. So you need more insulin, which can affect the leptin at the hypothalamus, but also has a direct effect on inflammation in the hypothalamus, and again, poor signaling. And this situation where your leptin levels are high, but actually your brain can't sense it. And the great analogy in the book to help people understand is like if you're driving along the highway or the motorway, and you see that your gas tank meter, your petrol meter is on empty, it's flashing. You start panicking. You think, "Oh God, I've got to fill up." So you look for the next petrol station. When you open the tank and start to fill up, you realize it's already full. The problem is the gas tank meter, the petrol meter, is broken. And this is what leptin resistance is. This actual feeling of being hungry, this feeling of having an empty tank, but actually having a tank that's far too full, having an oil tanker's worth of energy on board when you feel like you're on empty. That's what leptin resistance is, and that totally explains obesity.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, as you circle back to your obesity vulnerable types and your obesity sensitive, obviously this just amplifies everything, doesn't it, in terms of...
Yeah. And it's a scary condition. I mean, obesity, obviously I've spoken to thousands of patients with it from a very objective point of view, because I'm from, my dad's skinny, whatever. I got the way on. So very, very objective, having never been on a diet. Actually, this is quite a scary condition, not being able to get out of it, transiently being able to step out with some really, really calorie restrictive diet or whatever, but actually always being pulled back to that weight set point and that, societal perception that there's something wrong with you. Why can't you pull yourself together? Why can't you go on a diet or eat proper food and or go to the gym? And this is something that's affecting a third of our population. It's causing terrible, unhappiness and ill health. Type 2 diabetes, blood pressure, cholesterol, and things.
Yeah, I mean, it's staggering. And as you mentioned, when the food environment is ultra processed around us and them, then it's, it just amplifies this. To your point, there's almost nowhere to turn, and we're predisposing now all the chronic conditions, both physical and mental. And when we look at obesity, you also talk about obesity being a deficiency disease. Can you talk a little bit on the nutrition side? Does that type of diet, then that ultra processed food diet that people are struggling with, then lead to some nutrient deficiencies that can worsen or amplify what's going on there?
So there's a chapter in the book called, I think it's called the omega factor. And it talks about the omega-3 and omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And we're sure we've all heard of, omega-3 is supposed to be good for you. Mm-hmm. A lot of, some labeling says omega-6 is good for you, but they're both basically essential fatty acids, which means we can't produce them. Mm-hmm. And it's basically like the same as a vitamin. So if we don't have them in our diet, we can't produce them. So we're going to actually get some serious diseases. So it's a little bit like vitamin C, or and indeed examples in the book, vitamin B1, so with thiamine deficiency causing beriberi, or vitamin C deficiency causing scurvy. So these are the sort of historical examples of diseases that were there hundreds of years ago. A lot of research was done on them, but people didn't realize there were a deficiency. There was a lot of different explanations, Mm-hmm. So this chapter of the book looks at, is maybe obesity caused by some sort of deficiency or disruption of some sort of essential vitamin or fatty acid that we don't fully understand yet. And the whole chapter is a hypothesis, but I really do think that it's sort of on the right lines, and I think it may be proven in the future, because we know that populations who have Western foods, it's not just the sugar and the refined carbohydrates, but it's also the fact that the food has to be industrialized. It has to be stable. It has to sit on shelves for weeks and months on end in order for it to be profitable for food companies. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to take the omega-3 out of it, which is something that makes food go off. It's in fresh foods, in vegetables and meats and fish. And you have to replace that with omega-6, which is in pretty stable foods, so nuts and things like that, things that don't go off so much. And when we look at the omega-3-6 ratio in our cells, because omega-3 and 6 are very essential in signaling in our cells, the ratio in Western populations is massively disrupted. So we should have a ratio of about either 1-1 or 4-1 omega-6 to 3. But actually, in quite a lot of Western societies, it's 20-1. So we have a massive increase in omega-6 in our cellular sort of really important messaging part of our cells. And omega-6 causes inflammation, and it causes disruption of insulin signaling, whereas omega-3 decreases inflammation and improves insulin signaling. And the hypothesis is that, if you infuse Western population's diet with omega-6, vegetable oils basically, that population will increase their insulin, increase their inflammation, get leptin resistance, and become obese. And when you look at the epidemiology, it sort of seems to fit in. Yeah. So it's a sort of a hypothesis, and actually the book sort of expands into what happens with animals. So for instance, I mention
some of the tests on mice that you mentioned in the book. It's really fascinating.
So not just mice, but hibernating animals. Mm-hmm. So what is a signal that a brown bear gets as winter is approaching to get a voracious appetite and, put on 30, 40 kilograms, in order for it to have that fat to last it through the winter? Well, actually, when you look at some of the evidence there, the type of food that there is available is more sort of nuts and seeds in the winter. And that can affect the omega-3-6 sort of ratio in brown bears, and that may be the signal. There is some other evidence that vitamin D or even sunlight may be some sort of a signal. But we don't understand these things. But we know that there's something in the environment in the autumn that will stimulate some animals, hibernating or tupor animals, to put on a lot of weight. We don't fully understand. But my hypothesis is that maybe there's something in the Western diet that actually also signals, in a way we don't understand, large chunks of the population to, put on a lot of weight.
Yeah, I mean, it's you see the omega-6s, as you mentioned, very pro-inflammatory, and when we see the amounts that high, almost also serving as a proxy for processed food intake, because we know, as you mentioned, they're full of omega-6s, and so we've got this high processed food, which is bringing on too much energy and bringing on too much omega-6, which is contributing to this whole milieu of inflammation. And the idea of lacking in nutrients that the brain would then stimulate appetite to try to obtain, whether it's the protein or various nutrients, seems pretty
And the whole
compelling.
thing is, Mark, that the reason that our diet is infused with vegetable oils that are very stable, and also with sugars and refined carbohydrates, is this historical difficulty with saturated fat being linked with cardiac risk, which again is totally unpicked in the book. This research was biased and flawed, but so successful in changing the psyche of basically the whole world, associating, for instance, a juicy fatty steak with producing, furring up the arteries and cardiac risk, or, too much sausages or too much cheese or too many eggs. We still have this in our psyche. But actually, this research, as is totally unpicked in the book, is flawed. And there is increasing evidence that natural saturated fats, from red meat and dairy products, are not a massive cardiac risk. Maybe a very small risk for some people with natural high cholesterol levels. But actually, the real risk, cardiac risk, is sugar and refined carbohydrate, which increase triglyceride levels and give you the risks that way. Because governments had this wrong idea in the 1980s that saturated fat was going to cause their population to start dying up from cardiac disease, they gave us the dietary guidelines in the 1980s to reduce saturated fat and replace it with heart healthy vegetable oils, so flora, all of these rubbish margarines, totally artificial foods, and sugar and refined carbohydrate. They said whole grains, but no one really eats whole grains, and this is when obesity started taking off. From the 80s onwards, we didn't have a massive problem. Certainly when I was growing up in the 1980s, when I was in school, there wasn't a big problem in the early 80s. There wasn't a big problem with obesity. So it took off then. With those dietary guidelines, it was a little bit of a big experiment on public health, and it went wrong.
Yeah, I was going to segue into that. It's interesting you note. In Spain by 2040, they predicted to be the longest living people in the world. And of course, they consume above the 10% recommendation, which still exists in some countries for saturated fat intake. And of course, the French aren't far behind. And these are countries that are living the longest. And so when we talk about dietary patterns, and you alluded to it here, but we had Dr. Stefan Van Vliet from Duke University on earlier this season talking about how, the quality of one's diet influences, obviously, and the quality of the saturated fats and where they're coming from has a big influence on this. So could you talk a little bit about that diet quality piece? You have a chapter in the book around, the why cooking matters.
Going back to saturated fats, there is still some nutritional and epidemiological research connecting high saturated fat levels in a diet, a Western diet, with cardiac risk.
For sure.
But the problem is that they include things like palm oil, which is, it's now increasingly used in all processed foods because it's got great texture and it tastes okay.
Yeah,
it's really cheap. But that's that is a cardiac risk. Palmitic acid, palm oil, and that's muddied the waters as far as the sort of understanding of natural saturated fats are not palm oil. They are the saturated fats you get from dairy products and red meat. Towards the end of the book, I sort of give some just simple advice on, how to reduce your weight set point, not going on a diet, but actually just reduce the amount of insulin blocking leptin, the amount of vegetable oils blocking leptin, improve your cortisol level, and it's clean eating. Basically, the advice is to get your food from the butchers, the greengrocers, and the fishmongers. If you get your food from there, you'll be fine.
To go wrong, right?
And you'll lose a lot of weight if you're suffering. Chuck away the vegetable oils, and that's the main, and throw away the sugar foods and refined carbohydrates if you can. Just have it as a treat now and again. If you can do that and just change the way you eat, maybe not snack so much, a little bit of slight intermittent fasting or sort of 16-8 type way of eating, go towards that sort of traditional way of having 2 or 3 really hearty meals, not snacking too much between meals and having proper food. That's the type of eating that will actually change people's weight set points. So people, and I got a lot of feedback after the book. I've got hundreds of people that come back to me and say, look, I've tried this. It's like, I've lost a lot of weight. I tried all the diets before. So yeah, that's the clean eating thing. And you can't really do it unless you take time to shop for fresh foods and to cook it. So yeah, to look after yourself. I mean, actually these days you can actually get a delivery of fresh food. So you can get something like Gusto or Hello Fresh, which is actually great companies that will tell you how to cook the food. But you can't change your weight set point forever without being able to cook. You have to be able to cook to be able to insulate yourself from this sort of environment outside in London or New York or wherever we live in inner cities or Western societies. You got to insulate yourself from that type of food by just cooking your own food.
Yeah, it is amazing how just by cooking your own food, all of a sudden your protein intake goes up and vegetable intake goes up, and all these processed foods that we've talked about will decline. And so you naturally get this effect that you're after, and you start to build some of those habits. And can we talk a little bit about muscle, Doc? I mean, it's interesting working with NFL linemen or big rugby type players, some who are technically obese, but in their playing days are carrying loads of muscle mass. And so when we do look at their health markers and blood sugars and inflammation and all these, they're actually tremendous. But when they retire and the training goes down and the muscle mass comes down, if they don't change their ways, then we see these effects. So can you talk a bit about how muscle or even fitness can impact insulin sensitivity, leptin and chronic inflammation?
Yeah, you probably know a bit more about that side of things than me. But certainly in the book, one of the main factors, apart from our appetite and satiety, so these signals telling us how much to eat and when to stop. The other side of things is the energy expenditure, and it's not just in the gym or running for the bus or being active around the office and walking to work and whatever. 70% of our energy expenditure is through our basal metabolism. So the type of energy we need just to heat our bodies, the chemical reactions, beating heart, perfusion of the immune system, these sort of things. 70% of our metabolism. And it's very, very dynamic. It's very sort of plastic. It can change a lot within individuals, depending on whether your weight is lower than what your weight set point is or higher. And one of the studies in the book, we'll get onto muscle in a minute, how important this is as far as muscle is concerned. One of the sections in the book looks at these studies where they compare, for instance, cohorts of people who should have the same metabolic rate. So same age, same sex, same muscle mass, same heights, everything. They look the same. And you would expect from our medical training, we say, okay, we're going to put in a few factors into a complicated equation, and we're going to tell you that you've got a basal metabolism of 1,600 kilocalories a day. Then you add your activity, and then you can calculate, how much food you can eat in order to maintain or lose weight. When you look at the top 5% metabolizers in that cohort of people who are look identical, top 5% to lower 5%, there is a difference of 700 kilocalories per day between, just the basal metabolism. They can't help it. They can't do anything about it. This is the equivalent of a 10K run or a big 3-course meal. So this is why some people actually find it so easy just to maintain a normal weight and eat a load of food. And some people, not only do they have to be on a diet, but actually also have to go on to the gym, because this massive difference in basal metabolism, which can go up and down depending on, Now, the book goes into how our metabolism is changed, our basal metabolism. Again, not really very well understood by mainstream medicine and your average doctors. And there's two factors. One is the autonomic nervous system. So this is the thing that everyone knows. It's the fight or flight response. So if you're faced with a mugger or a lion or whatever, you're going to get your heart rate's going to start going, your adrenaline's going to start going, you're going to start sweating, you're going to be actually quite strong and fast, So that's a sympathetic drive. When you're scared, you're either fight or you run away fast. The other drive is a parasympathetic drive when you're actually very, very relaxed at home, listen to some music, maybe before bed, your blood pressure's down, you're not heating your body very well, you're preserving energy. Now you're ready for bed. That's called the parasympathetic drive. And that's how we traditionally understand the autonomic nervous system. But actually, there is quite a lot of evidence, if you look out there, that people who overeat get an increased sympathetic drive. So all the time, their blood pressure is higher, their pulse is higher, and they're heating their bodies. They're actually expending energy via this system. The system's not just used to be scared and run away or fight. It's also used, I think, to expend excess energy taken in, for instance, the Western diet. And again, when you look at people who have been on low-calorie diets, they have increased sympathetic drive. We know actually the best thing for treatment of blood pressure is go on a diet. And this is the reason it increases sympathetic drive. And that autonomic nervous system is one of the main strategies the body uses to try and keep us within this weight set point. Depending on, even if we're overeating or undereating, it will just change the amount of energy that we're using. The second factor that I've sort of looked into as far as, metabolic adaptation is where we get into the muscle, okay? And this is something called sarcoleptin, which is in skeletal muscles. So there's a lot of research out there. I mean, I'm sure you've touched on the research in your studies, in your books, on brown adipose tissue. So brown fat in particularly mice, small rodents, their surface to weight area, they actually get very, very cold unless they have little internal warmers. Mm-hmm. Their brown fat actually works as a conduit to convert food energy into thermal energy. So it just keeps them hot. So like the Ready Brick advert, you can imagine that. It's like it just keeps them warm, a little internal heater. Mm-hmm. We know that humans also have brown fat, particularly babies. So the smaller you are, the more brown fat ratio you have. In adults, it's not really quite as significant. But the researchers are crazy to find something out of that brown fat and actually stimulate it, because if they could do that, then we would be able to have almost like a dietary or a way of manipulating our metabolism to just burn off a load of energy so we could lose weight. And there's been some, I'm sure you've looked into it, so the only way of stimulating it is to put someone in a freezer for
I was going to say,
basically
cold immersions.
Cold immersions. So that is not going to become a mainstream therapy. But actually, there is increasing evidence that the skeletal muscle has a type of brown fat, so a type of mechanism where food energy or chemical energy from food can actually be converted into thermal energy. It's called thermogenesis. So uncoupling of the mitochondria, ATP, in the mitochondria, in the cellular sort of engine. So this is a really, really important way that, again, we can burn off energy seamlessly if we overeat and not put weight on. And again, that's switched off if we go on a diet. And the other thing that the book looks at, as far as muscle is concerned, is if you're very sedentary, you don't do any exercise. If it's almost like a cultural thing that you don't do any exercise, and we look at the example is, particularly women in the Middle East, culturally, they're not really supposed to do a great deal in the daytime. A lot of them have help. They don't even have to look after their children. They just sit around. They get sarcopenia, so they get a muscle wasting. Yeah. And these are the women who actually suffer the most with obesity in the Middle East. So over 50% of the Arab population, female, are now obese, over 50%, with about a quarter of the population diabetic. And a lot of it, I think, is due to sarcopenia. The only exercise they get is going around the shopping mall. But
it's tough. I mean, muscle obviously a sponge for glucose, and
it's. I'm actually going to be studying your book, Marc.
Appreciate it. Nice.
Which I just bought because actually, I mean, my book didn't really delve too much into muscle because I think it is very important. But I'm going to try and learn a little bit more and see how I can fit some of my ideas with your ideas in that.
Oh, tremendous. Well, listen, I mean, as muscle, we talk about, the myokines being signaled, and with fat, we have the adipokines. And in this COVID environment where people are thinking about how to keep their immune system strong, how to, if they do catch COVID, how to not have an adverse, too adverse a time. In your experience with clients, obviously with very overweight, obese clients, it seems like a time where we should be helping folks out in terms of what they're eating and how they're moving. And I appreciate that the government guidelines are around prevention, but this idea of supporting our immune systems by getting fitter, eating better, trying to lose some weight, is there certain messaging, or how do you communicate that with your patients?
Yeah, so patients are increasingly worried about the risk of obesity, sort of increasing the risk of COVID infection. And also during lockdown, a lot of people put a lot of weight on. Mm. So yeah, they're acutely aware that there is issues, and yeah, they're certainly receptive to dietary and lifestyle changes. The problem is most people who come to me in clinic are really quite severely obese, so they've got like full-blown obesity, the disease causing leptin resistance. Even with good lifestyle changes, it's not going to totally get rid of the disease. It's like if you've got diabetes, you can't reverse it just with dietary
overnight
changes. Yeah. The big issue is, we've had a pandemic now, a COVID pandemic, and we've had massive government intervention to help stop people dying, including, locking people up for months on weeks on end, in their own houses. Now, the new paperback part of the book has a chapter on COVID, and it sort of speculates why, if we're going to do so much for a viral infection, why don't we, just move a little bit towards helping this other pandemic that we've had for the last 20 years? It kills a lot more people every year than
orders of magnitude, right?
Massive amounts of. It causes cardiac disease. It causes death. It causes diabetes. It causes cancer. So massive amounts of not just death, but also unhappiness,
suffering,
and quality of life. Why can't the government intervene, not in such a way that they did with COVID, but actually in a little bit of a way? We need actually some control on the amount of processed food that the population are exposed to. And the only way of doing that is actually, it's a bit political, but is actually to tax quite heavily processed foods, and to actually put those proceeds into proper education about just eat normal food, go back to normal food, don't go to the supermarket, just buy vegetables, meat, fish, and cook. If we can do that, this pandemic of obesity would actually be seriously affected in a good way, and we would save a lot of lives. But the whole crux is, that people don't understand obesity. Mm. I think the government would do it if they understood obesity, but they don't understand obesity.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it? I mean, even in a back garden vegetable patch, you can grow so many vegetables. You have to start giving them away to your neighbors because you can't literally get through them fast enough. And to your point, the economics of trying to make some of these foods a bit more cost effective would be tremendous to help people out. And of course, hopefully now with maybe some of the remote working, people are working long hours, they don't sleep enough. Maybe that can sort of tip the balance and people have a chance to start to get into more of these things.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the whole problem is that, the traditional understanding of obesity is it's just purely energy in and energy out. That is the ultimate, but actually there is a lot before that affecting your behavior and your metabolism. And, if we concentrate just on calories, we're not concentrating on what the food does to our bodies, does to our insulin, does to our cortisol, does to our omega-3/6 ratio, and the effect that has on our weight set point. That's the sort of the calorie in, calorie out thing is a bit of a smokescreen, and that's the reason I think that the government still don't really understand what to do regarding obesity, and really want to encourage people just to try and control your calories. It's not about that. It's actually about controlling the type of food you eat, because that's going to control ultimately the amount of calories you want to put in.
Yeah, it is a bit of a crutch, isn't it? Because it doesn't really tell you how to do things like you're mentioning with the appetite and psychological, emotional stress, and how that kicks up as you described, cortisol and impacting all those pathways. Listen, Doc, this has been tremendous. I mean, I really enjoyed the book. It takes a wonderful deep dives and stories into background information on all this stuff. And if you had to leave folks with one tip to be able to support sort of better health going into 2022, What might you say?
So there'd probably be a couple of tips. So the first would be the greengrocers, butchers, and fishmongers diet. Cook your food, don't snack, have a relatively early night, look after yourself, sleep well, and do a little bit of exercise that you actually enjoy, 2 or 3 times a week. If you do that, you're going to reduce your weight set point. If you're just suffering a little bit with overweight, which is actually what the book's designed for, you're going to lose a stone or two and actually have a better quality of life.
100%. I mean, it's amazing how simple but not easy. But if you do repeat that, just as you mentioned, that consistency, then it's amazing what people can achieve. So again, Doc, I really appreciate you carving out some time. Where could people stay connected with some of your work? And obviously, I imagine Amazon and the major booksellers they can pick up the book.
Yeah, so I've got a copy here, so I'll do a plug. Why We Eat Too Much on Amazon and major booksellers, including Tesco. If you Google me, you'll get my email address. You can ask questions.
Tremendous. Well, we'll include all those links in the show notes so people can get a hold of you as well. And again, really appreciate you carving out some time today.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers for your interest, mate.